afternoon and welcome. I'm Chris Prosser, the events manager for the Worcester Business Journal, and we're happy to have you all join us today for this special webcast on cybersecurity, where our panel of good guys will provide helpful insight on steps you can take to protect your organization from the bad guys. With the resurgence of cyber attacks, companies large and small should be prepared to respond to these disruptive cyber incidents. This session aims to give you a better understanding of how you can identify the threats and keep your organization safe. This session is brought to you by the support of our webcast sponsor, Middlesex Savings Bank. They have been supporting our webcast series over the past couple of years, and we thank them for their commitment to providing valuable programs to the region's business community. Before we jump into the panel discussion, just a couple of quick notes for the audience. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. And today's webcast is being recorded and a link will be sent after the event. Now let's get started. Our moderator today is Alan Falcon, who is the CEO and founder of Cumulus Global. Cumulus helps small and mid-sized enterprises get more value from their existing IT and new managed cloud services and technologies. And our panel that we have joining us are Andy Anderson. Andy is the CEO and co-founder of DataStream Insurance, and Andy is also the host of the Cybercrime Lab podcast.
Hey, Chris,
Gregory,
thanks.
Welcome. Gregory Berks. Greg is a Senior Vice President and Director of Operational Risk, Vendor Management, and Information Security for Middlesex Savings Bank. Welcome, Greg.
Hi, everyone.
And unfortunately, due to an unavoidable conflict, Patrick Tracy is unable to join us today. However, we are very pleased to have Bill Roberts join us. Bill is a partner with Dave Pitney, LLP, and also leads the firm's cyber group. Welcome, Bill. Welcome, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. We're looking forward to this conversation. Alan, the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you, Chris, for the great introduction, and welcome, everyone. We always appreciate folks taking time out of their busy day and week to join us and participate. So please take advantage of the Q&A window as well. And I want to thank my fellow panelists. To sort of kick things off, it's really easy, particularly being a technologist, to throw statistics and scare people. And sometimes that works and other times it doesn't. But I think there are some three key statistics about cybersecurity and cybercrime that small, mid-sized enterprises, mid-market companies should be aware of. And that's currently in the US, a business is a victim of a successful cyber attack every 39 seconds. And it's not just big name businesses. These are, the shotgun approach, see who we can catch. So even small businesses get caught in the web. Recent studies of technology providers and the impact on their clients of cyber attacks finds that for small, mid-sized businesses and low mid-market companies, the average financial impact, particularly for the small business, is about $210,000. And so even if you're a small local business, the cost of a breach or a cyber attack can be significant to you and your business. And the third statistic is that 60% of small businesses that have a major cybersecurity incident fail within 6 months because the impact of the incident and the recovery is so great on the business operations. Now, that said, there is a solution framework. And I know a lot of people listening will think, oh, I'll put in malware protection on my computer and download the latest antivirus program and I'm good and I'm protected. But it's a lot more complicated than that. Most cyber attacks initiate with emails and use human factors engineering and behavioral analysis. So you need to make sure your people are aware of what's going on and have the policies in place to educate, communicate the risk, have your team understand what they should and shouldn't be doing related to cybersecurity. Obviously, there's technologies you can put in place to protect your business and prevent attacks and protect if an attack does happen, but no protection is ever perfect. And so you also need to have the planning, the resources, and the technology in place, not only to restore damaged data or systems, but to recover your business operations and be able to return to normal business operations. And so even recovery isn't just a technology issue, it's a people, process, and resource issue as well. And so as we think about that sort of framework and how you attempt to solve cybercrime and protect your business and be able to respond, well, let me start asking the panelists some questions. And I'll start with you, Gregory. What are some of the security, being a bank, you're a frequent victim of attacks, both direct as well as people trying to impersonate your bank to steal from your clients. So what kind of security measures should we have in place?
Thanks, Alan. Well, I think the first thing that I'd mention is at the very top level, everyone should have an IT policy that will really be the framework for your IT infrastructure and your IT security practices. Developing an IT policy will add structure and define how you manage your IT risk. That being said, what is typically in a good IT policy? You have things like patching and vulnerability scanning, and the key elements of your IT policy should include things like how frequently you scan and how frequently you patch. And then how do you identify down-level systems that may cause some type of vulnerability or risk exposure to your infrastructure? And additionally, is there someone assigned to help you respond to an incident if you do have one? What if you need to run a forensic investigation? Have you prepared for that? Another key one that comes to mind is, user access. So review of user access to systems is, one of the things that's super easy, but it seems like nobody does it. What employees have access to what? Do you have access to more systems or functionalities than they need? How do you assess who needs what to what systems? And or do you just open it up to all employees, because that seems to be the easiest method, where give everyone administrative access and then you never have to touch it again? Not a particularly good idea. So take a good look at your user access. Next thing, restrict access to the internet and external email sources if you can, where don't just open up the internet, don't just open up your email. If an employee doesn't need email, just don't automatically give it to them. Don't automatically give them unbridled internet access where they can go anywhere. Why not shut down those traffic methods and lock it down and just eliminate the phishing risk, eliminate the risk they'll go to a nefarious site? Seems like a pretty simple solution, but a lot of times companies just assume that all employees need internet access, and sometimes they don't. Next thing I have is, web filtering, where, it should be configured so, you know what sites that your employees are going to. They're not allowed to go to nefarious sites or adult sites, for that matter, which are riddled in malware. So, check out your web filtering and how that's configured, and make sure that it's locked down to business-related sites, and that'll really protect you. Moving forward, I mentioned on it before, incident response procedures. Have you kind of talked through, what you do when, if you had an incident? Do you have an incident response triage team? Do you have cyber insurance? I know we're going to talk about that later, but have you run through what the protocol is to get travelers or whoever provides you with cyber insurance involved? Are the backups air-gapped, meaning segregated from the rest of your network so ransomware can't hop over? Or on an annual basis, you should really be walking through possible incident scenarios to get a sense about how you'll react and whether or not you need to put in additional recovery measures. For those of you out there that have small IT teams, probably not a bad idea for you to engage, a forensic firm or an incident response firm that can help you if you ever have an incident, and, they can bring a team of IT specialists in and really help you. Other things, email filtering. A lot of times companies just don't have any email filtering whatsoever. So whatever's coming into email, that's what their employees receive. And if their employees click on it and, anti-malware is not effective, then ransomware could spread. You could have an incident. And of course, the last one, user training. One of the most important elements of your IT policy is user training. Do your employees understand what the risks are? Do you have an employee handbook that outlines what they can and can't do on your corporate network? Do they understand that they shouldn't be browsing the internet and why they shouldn't be browsing the internet, or they shouldn't be using corporate email for personal use? Are you reviewing employee activity, web filtering, reporting on the internal network to make sure that they're not going to adult sites? Do you train your employees on keeping your company or corporate data confidential? Have you trained them on how to identify phishing emails? Do you test them with phishing simulations? So, these are all things that are kind of quick wins, but, everyone likes to say that users are the weakest link in IT security. However, a well-trained employee can be the best and last line of defense against a breach. So conversely, an employee that has received no training can be a huge risk to malware, ransomware, and data loss So, make the effort to train them and give them the tools they need to identify attacks. So, I think I'll stop there and see if there's any other questions or comments from the panelists.
Well, I think that was a pretty good overview and actually somewhat in depth to the various aspects. And one component is that, smaller companies may not have any dedicated internal IT resources. So you're really depending on your IT service provider to be knowledgeable and offer those services or be able to connect you with those services when you need them. And even larger organizations may not have the ability to have all of that expertise in-house, and will need some of those components. And not to, pile it on, but in addition to having the technology, the process, the policies in place, internally, organizations do need to worry about a growing array of regulatory requirements and industry standards. And so, Bill, in your role, in the legal side of cybercrime and cybersecurity, what are some of the key regulatory and industry requirements that you're seeing existing and evolving that impact companies in their cybersecurity planning and response?
Yeah, certainly. And this is a really timely presentation and a timely question, because 2023 is shaping up to be the year of new privacy rules. There's a tremendous number of new laws coming on the books nationwide that are going to have a material impact on how businesses use, collect, and disclose data. But I do want to take a quick step back before getting into 2023 and just talk about how small and mid-sized businesses should be viewing this question generally. So historically speaking, the US has taken a very sectoral approach to data privacy laws, where you've had FERPA, for example, for public schools and most higher ed, HIPAA for healthcare providers, healthcare technology companies, insurance, Gramm-Leach-Bliley for most of finance and banking, et cetera. So certain companies have been dealing with these things for a decade or more now. But those are also growing. So it is important for any business to take a look at what is their specific sector, and then what are the requirements, both on the legal side, the data privacy side, and then also to what Greg was talking about in terms of IT security. Because, for example, if you have a mid-sized business and you are what's called a business associate to maybe a health insurer, like maybe one of the folks on the call, one of their big customers is Cigna, and they receive some claims data as part of that engagement. By being subject to HIPAA, you need to do everything that Greg was talking about, but in a very specific and documented HIPAA compliant way, the HIPAA security rule. So first, I would look at your sector, figure out with your counsel or advisor, what are the laws that apply here? Once you have that as your foundation, then you could take a broader look at laws of more general application. So, for example, in Massachusetts, Mass is one of the only states with a WISP requirement, a written in informational security plan, and it doesn't need to be a very long document that your IT security folks can be preparing for you, and it's really a method by which the Commonwealth wants you to be documenting all of the certain data security requirements in the law, that most of which overlap with what Greg was talking about. That's a really important document to have. And then you want to look at state breach laws, both in your home state and in other states, particularly in New England, where you may have employees living in Connecticut, Rhode Island, or maybe up in New Hampshire. You may need to comply with data breach laws in all of those states. And the third bucket is laws, which is actually just what we were talking about before we turned on the live recording, are laws and actually in other states that may apply. So a big one, as some of the folks on the call may be aware of, is California. So California has had the CCPA for a couple of years, and it's replacing it with something called the CPRA, effective the 1st of 2023. So this is a huge thing for companies, including the greater Worcester area, if you have employees in California, or if you have like direct consumer relationships with California residents, you may need to be subject to that. You may be subject to that law as well. And while it goes into effect 1/1/23, you do have until July, and maybe even longer, since California is like 9 months late with regs, I think, at this point. So we may get a bit lucky in terms of having more time. But that's really an overview of how you take a step-by-step approach to figuring out what laws apply to my business, and what are some of the ways in which I can work with my advisors to comply on both the legal side and the IT side.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I don't know if other folks have comments on that, but what we often hear is a small business will say, well, gee, I think I've got good technology in place. My people are smart. I think I understand the laws. So I talked to my insurance agent and got a cyber insurance policy, so I'm protected, right? Should anything bad happen. So I'm going to start by asking Andy, what is the role of cyber insurance in protecting your business, in a business, and what limitations are there to that protection?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we're seeing in general in the sort of world of cyber security and cyber risk is, just as a general maturing of the market, right? I mean, in some ways, we when you compare how we've been thinking about this risk relative to other areas where we've dealt with risk, it's a much newer threat. I mean, you look at, we've been dealing with the threat of fire, with, weather damage, with, auto accidents, often for decades more, if not hundreds of years more, right? And and often you've seen insurance play a really interesting role there in bringing industries together and in sort of setting the standards for what is actually reducing the risk of to individuals, to businesses, et cetera, in those ecosystems. And I think what you're seeing is that insurance is starting to play that role as well in the cyber area. And in some ways, insurance is kind of playing this role as a de facto regulator, right? And often tying and pulling together a lot of the, the requirements across industries, across states that you're seeing. And so I think, if you're sitting on this panel and listening into what we're talking about, this can seem incredibly complicated, right? Like, oh my gosh, I've got technology, I've got legal, I've got insurance things to think about. And you know what? I'm just supposed to be running my business here, right? How do I handle all these? And I think the way that you've seen other areas get addressed is that you often are bringing together experts across these domains, and essentially they're collaborating on behalf of a client, and they're working together to make sure that a client is fully covered, right? And that's what we are often doing, and insurance is sitting there. Often, obviously, it's there as a protection in case the worst happens, right? And it is. I was sort of blown away by how good the coverage was that was available and you could get from cyber insurance. It's not all policies are like that. There's not every cyber insurance policy has the appropriate limits, has the appropriate coverages, right? But there are plenty of policies out there that are really, really good. But you want to make sure that you're doing all the things that policy is requiring you to do prior to putting it in place. That you actually, when you're attesting the fact that you have certain technologies and security controls in place, when you're attesting to the fact that you've complied with certain regulations, that you've actually done those things. So, and that's not, if you're working with someone who knows this space, a broker who understands and does this, that's not super hard. I mean, there's some paperwork, there's some conversations that happen across the organization, sometimes with outside IT firms as well, who are working on your behalf. But it's a risk that can be addressed, and for the most part, largely mitigated, right? There's always things. I mean, there's things that in cyber that all insurance won't cover. War risk is one, and cyber's perhaps more affected by war-like events than other areas, right? We've been lucky enough, at least in this country, not to face a war on our shores, probably since the Civil War, right? But that those things are happening, and you're seeing cyber attacks happen. But the vast majority of risks, and 99% of the attacks that we see are criminal related, or insider threat, or other, or just plain mistakes and bad things that happen. And cyber insurance is a great, augment to what you're doing on the legal and the technical side, right?
Yeah, I was just going to chime in too. One of the things I find to be really helpful to pick up on some of Andy's points is not to rush into cyber insurance, to spend time, first of all, finding the right broker, which is something that we were talking about prior, is really going, you could go to, almost any broker and get auto insurance because it's extremely mature, developed, good data. But I have seen a lot of problems come up with small to mid-sized businesses, not just taking the time to find the appropriate broker, someone with background in this field. I think that's really important, not going to necessarily to your friend from college who does your general liability. Find the right broker. And then even when you find the right broker, don't rush to apply. Work with that broker to get your house in order beforehand, because many insurers will even deny coverage if you don't have the proper cybersecurity in place, or your premiums can be absolutely exorbitant if you don't. Yeah. It is well worth working with the broker to bring in an IT firm to do almost like a pre-insurance review. So we have some companies who we work with will come in and say, what, you are like, let's pick up on my example from before with like Cigna. Your business is one where you serve health insurance companies. So you should be subject to HIPAA. You probably are. You should have a program, but before you actually submit your application, work with your broker, have someone from an IT perspective come in, do a quick review, see what, because you could be fine and nothing needs to change, or you could do a lot of that work ahead of time, which is going to get you much better coverage. It's going to allow your broker to get you better premium, better retention. It's well worth it. So I completely agree with Andy. Cyber insurances can be extremely useful, but you do want to take it in a very deliberate manner with the right folks.
Yeah, I didn't pay Bill too much before we came on this call to say these things,
but my hourly rate is going up actually, Andy. So you're just.
But yeah, I mean, I think people don't realize. I mean, we often equate this to a medical analogy. Dealing with cyber insurance is super specialized, right? It's like it's the open heart surgery of insurance. So we work with lots of businesses, and they have their generalist broker, their family doctor, who's great for all the normal things, but cyber, there's 40 plus different carriers. Each one of them has a different policy. The wording is different, the coverage is different, the requirements are different, the applications are different. And what seems the wording in those applications are very, very specific, and if you're not used to seeing what they're asking about, you can you can put yourself in a position where you misrepresent yourself. Usually the vast majority of the time that's unintentional by the insured, like they didn't realize what they were saying or they believed they had done something. Every once in a while, people say, well, can't we just say we did that? And I'm like, I don't look good in orange, and I don't think you do either, right? I mean, lying on an insurance application is about the dumbest thing you can do, because they're going to figure it out, and then it's really simple to deny coverage, right? But taking the time to understand it, and what we often do with clients is actually create a nice sort of documentary trail for why you answered the questions the way that you did. That is not a requirement from any carrier, but it's just going to make claims a lot simpler, because you can, you attested to this and you got the support as to why you did it, right? And particularly insurance, it's interesting, right? Like it's not necessarily the truth, but the belief. You believe that this was true, and if you got really good support to show that you believe that was true, right, and you've done a reasonable job to do that, you're going to be in a pretty good position should you need to be.
And from the technology service provider side, we see two other aspects around cyber insurance. One is, you discussed how you answer certain questions could cause you to be denied or could greatly affect your rates. In some instances, we're seeing the underwriters coming back and saying, we think your security is weak in this area. We will underwrite the policy if you deploy this specific technology. And
Yep.
Sometimes it's even a specific vendor, which is fine unless that's too expensive or not the right fit for your environment, and you can get caught there. And the other thing, as Andy mentioned about documenting why you're answering the questionnaires the way you are, provides the context. We're aware of companies who, when they applied for their policy, said that they were doing regular backups and doing periodic testing. Company had a breach, and the first question from the underwriter was, show us your procedural logs that you've validated that your backups work, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a reason, putting the context with how you're answering the questions, but also then making sure that if you're committing to something, that you not only do it, but you have that documentation that it's getting done. And so,
yeah, and I think I'd love to throw it back to Greg, because I think one of the things that, and I think you gave a great intro, Greg, in terms of all the things that you can do. And I think one of the things that we're seeing smart organizations do is think about the security of things, right? And again, this is perhaps semantic, but I often think about security as, trying to stop these events, but also, Greg, you touched on sort of the resiliency, right? And thinking about, should these incidents happen, also having thought through, some of those ways that you're going to recover from them, knowing that, nothing is perfect and that these incidents will happen.
Yep.
Maybe you could touch on that. That'd be really interesting.
Yeah, I was going to say, totally agree with you guys. IT testing, another key part of your IT policy. So, do you have methods to ensure your patching and vulnerability is occurring timely? Do you routinely assess your user access reviews? You got to develop a testing program, and typically that means a third party. So I love the idea of small businesses engaging a third party for some type of audit on an annual basis. I mean, it just makes all the sense in the world. Then when you're filling out your insurance application, you essentially have a document that all your IT security controls are operating effectively. And, you can go, hey, Andy, here you go. This is, proof that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. So it just makes good sense to make sure that you're safe and it's not going to affect your coverage. And I also wanted to reiterate, we've dealt with this at the bank too, where, the application process is stringent and it's becoming more stringent. And, there are those times when we're not sure whether or not we meet the criteria for answering a question of yes. So we always go back and ask clarifying question. And then if we have to answer no, then we start the implementation process. But we would never, say yes to a question that we're not absolutely sure that we're doing, because we know it's probably going to exclude us from obtaining coverage. The other thing I wanted to touch on briefly is threat intelligence. Everyone should be looking at threat intelligence. So you got to keep up to date with your current attack methods and what the threat actors are using. How do you do this? Everyone should, have a procedure, at the bank on a monthly basis, which is excessive for a lot of small businesses, but we monitor the ongoing threat environment for risks through FSISAC and Krebs on security. And, between 600 and 1,200 alerts per month are triaged that we go through and we respond to them. At the very least, you should be looking at what's out there and seeing whether or not your systems, need updates or those alerts are applicable to you. And of course, the key is really communicating and educating your employees about what the threats are so they know and they can identify what they are. So hopefully you can avoid an incident. And then it gets back to what Andy was saying about incident response, where you should be testing your incident response plan. You should have an incident response plan. And if you don't have, the IT resources or the IS staff internally, then go to a third party and then they can run it for you. And you can get a forensic firm and they can come in a couple of times a year, update the incident response plan, take a look at your systems. They can work with your internal auditors and, make sure that things are in good shape in case you have an incident.
And that brings up an interesting point, Gregory, where one of the challenges is keeping up with the attackers, right? That, we often talk about phishing emails. Now people are getting phishing texts, oh, there's a problem with your account. We're sending you a code. Please give us the code, right? Well, excellent. Someone's trying to break your two-factor authentication. And so, what's the challenge there? Because, the most commonly understood, or I don't want to say the word popular, but the most popular form of attack, that we see in the media is the ransomware attack. That's one we hear about. Yet in many instances, much more expensive is the business email compromise attack, which is a different style. So can you talk about the challenge of keeping up?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to threat intelligence again, where, you didn't know what's out there and you need to educate, your staff and employees about what's out there so they can react accordingly. And it's tough. The bad guys are very, very good at what they do. So you just need to make sure you're aware of what the current threat attack vectors are. And, if there's additional controls, if there's, tweaks to your controls that you can make, perhaps, lengthening passwords, adding an additional layer of authentication that removes the threat vector, you kind of have to be proactive and reactive to the threat intelligence environment. It's not just consume it and then forget about it. It's consume it, take a look at your controls, make sure that your controls are going to mitigate the threat. And if they don't, remediate, bump them up, make passwords, instead of 14 characters, make them 18 characters, make a, one-time PIN for network authentication. So there are things you can do, but it's more the reaction based off of what it is that the threat actors are doing.
And I think one of those, I love that. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is that, this audience, I know, looking at kind of who registered, skews towards the IT side of the house, right? It's folks who, and I'm sure a lot of you feel like Cassandra, right? You've been jumping up and down, saying we should be worried about this. We should be worried about this. And often that is falling on deaf ears, right? Like often the non-IT folks are sort of grown numb to this threat. And so I think what we're seeing is IT leaders use some of these processes as opportunities to pull other parts of their leadership team and parts of their organization into the conversation. And I would encourage IT leaders to do that in non-technical ways. And a lot of the components that we're talking about are not technical ones, right? Putting in place, the incident response plan. That's not really about mostly technical stuff. It's mostly about who do you contact and when will you contact them and how is the organization going to respond to them, right? And so, right. And honestly, going through some of these, we sometimes do tabletops with clients. So like a mock incident, that can be really eye-opening for, an organization, and it's not about the ones and the zeros. It's, oh my gosh, if nothing turned on when we sat down at our desks, what would we do? And the thinking of that isn't often, let's put in another system. It's okay, how have we structured ourselves? How have we thought about things in that resilient mindset, right? And often where we see organizations fail is they've tried to make things too complicated and less comprehensive, right? And to step back and say, okay, let's make sure that we've got the basics of everything here in place, and really have walked around this problem from 3 or 4 different directions. And again, so many of the people in the space are they're technical people, so they want to build that perfect Rube Goldberg machine that will stop every mouse that gets in, and that is not what is going to save you, right? It's having all the basics in place, and that will help limit the damage or eliminate a ton of things.
Yeah, Andy, that's a good point. I was going to say, I recommend everyone do a risk assessment of their environment so they can take a risk-based approach, and that will focus the efforts where they need to be. Where the highest risks are, that's where you should put the money. And, don't stay away from those areas that are low risk. So the only way you know what those are is by running through, what's going to cause an operational outage, what's going to be expensive, what the critical aspects of your business are, and then focus on those and make sure those are protected. And then it doesn't make a lot of sense, like you said, to put, a security asset or a piece of hardware in that costs $1 million and not configure it properly. So if you're going to put application whitelisting in, or expensive firewalls, or a lot of security, or a SIM, alert management, whatever it is, make sure you take the time to operationalize it, and you have the staff, or you outsource the staff that can actually run that so it's effective.
And we need to keep in mind that, no protection is going to be perfect, and as we talk about how to simplify and focus efforts on the awareness, communication, protection, and prevention side, the incident response process in and of itself is complicated. As an IT service provider, our clients would expect us to remediate the problem and get, restore any data that's been lost and get their systems up and running again. But the vast majority of IT service companies, managed service providers, even managed security service providers don't have the tools and the specific skill sets to do the forensics analysis. That's a very niche, expensive specialty, which when you think about incident response, who's involved? It's the cyber insurance agent and underwriter. Your legal team is going to get involved, and we'll talk about, I have some questions for Bill on that coming up, as well as potentially law enforcement. And so it's not uncommon for the insurer or law enforcement to say, don't recover your data, don't touch your systems, we need to investigate, which can lead into other aspects. But on the legal side, Bill, from a legal standpoint, what's your role in an incident response? Because the laws don't just say how you have to protect yourself, they often stipulate how you have to respond. And when should law enforcement get involved?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple things. So I think we've touched upon this a few times, but bad breaches happen to good companies. No matter what we're talking about here, you could have an unlimited budget, which no one on this phone has, or in this panel. There will be breaches, and that's just, from my perspective, a fact of life. And it's important for to keep in mind for clients when they have a breach. They tend to get worried about 2 things. They tend to worry about a government enforcement action, or they tend to worry about lawsuits arising from the breach from employees or consumers. We have several class actions currently, and they're becoming far more common. It really is the plaintiff's bar. I hope there's no plaintiff's attorney on this call, but they are picking up on data breaches like the new slip and fall cases. And I think that what that means for clients, for companies, there's really two things. Everything that Greg has been talking about, there's multiple purposes for that. yes, it is of course to protect your business, but it's also to be able and to reduce the likelihood of a breach. But it's also content for your counsel to use when your counsel is explaining to the attorney general that, again, a bad breach, good company. It's valuable for the insurance process, as Andy mentioned, and it's extremely valuable should you ever have a breach and get sued, because that story, the story that your lawyers will tell, is based upon all the work you did 3 months ago, 6 months ago, 5 years ago, to have your security in place. So there's nothing better as an attorney on the defense side, like me, to tell an attorney general, yes, we had a breach, but look, here's 8 years worth of annual pen tests and 8 years worth of risk assessments. Here is our 5-year plan for IT spending. And 99% of the time, that's like, wow, it's like, great, you did everything right and a bad breach happened anyway. Most of the time, companies who get in trouble, either in terms of a lawsuit or government enforcement, don't get in trouble because the breach happened. They get in trouble because they didn't prepare for the breach ahead of time, like everything Greg is talking about, or they didn't respond to it in a thoughtful or timely manner. That's really where I see things. Not that the breach happened, but that you didn't prepare for the breach or work to prevent it from happening. And then if it did happen, you didn't take it very seriously. So I just, in terms of that broader picture there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had some really interesting conversations with folks around the line of sort of reasonable security, right? And the idea that you have done what would be reasonable for someone in your business, and to think about that, particularly when you think of all the parties involved, right? Like, it's not just what's a reasonable level of investment and risk tolerance for not only you, but your customers, your suppliers, everyone that essentially your organization takes, right? And perhaps you can or can't opine on this, Bill, in terms of, from an attorney general's perspective or from a plaintiff's counsel, if you've done all those things, right? I mean, you can, right, Alan, one every 39 seconds, right? Like every, hundreds of thousands of businesses are getting hit. So saying that, like, you're the one who this happened to is kind of not that unusual. But what is problematic is when you've not done the things that are reasonable. And again, you've been the proverbial ostrich with your head in the sand, pretending like this isn't going to happen to me. I'm not going to do anything, right? That's when you start to see regulators and plaintiffs' counsel say, we're going to punish you for being, for taking undue risk with, citizens, individuals, whoever that may be, data and security, right?
Yeah, certainly. And depending upon the particular sector you're in, you may have multiple federal and state agencies. So, for example, in Mass, you have both the Department of Consumer Protection with authority, can bring unfair trade practices claims. You also have the Attorney General with authority. If you are a boarding school, a college, you may have the Department of Education could be involved, the State Department of Education. If you're in healthcare, Health and Human Services, it's not unreasonable to have, like many of our larger breaches, when you get into the millions, of having 15 to 20 different federal and state agencies investigating at the same time. Now, we do work, of course, to consolidate that. But you do want to be able to go to these regulators with a story of responsibility, the documentation of taking things seriously, a story that this is my industry, this is my budget, this is my size, these are my resources, and with that, I did X, Y, and Z, and that's reasonable because. And everything Greg was talking about, that's the content that your counsel will need when something happens to defend you. So it's really, really vital. Now, I wouldn't be the first lawyer to say like someone's note on a napkin is a compliant WISP, you don't really want to be to that point. And then on your point with plaintiff's counsel is don't tend to be as reasonable as the Mass Attorney General. And one of the nice things about being in the Northeast is that we do have AG offices, particularly in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, who are national leaders on cybersecurity. They really are, along with a few other states like California. Because of that, they're really good at spotting when a company is not acting in an appropriate manner. And then for plaintiff's counsel, the most important thing is to have the complaint dismissed or dropped before it even moves forward. So you want to give your counsel a really strong amount of ammo to say, you know what, this is not worth your time because you're going to lose because we've done everything right. And, you know, the gold standard for this kind of thing is like getting high trust certified or ISO, which I know is not practical for everyone. So I'm not even want to say you don't, from a legal side, you don't need to do all of that. But you do need to have the documentation that Greg and Andy were talking about, that you're taking a reasonable approach with respect to your business.
And I guess I've got a follow-on related question for Andy about incident response, and that oftentimes the cyber insurance carrier sort of becomes the ringmaster, project manager for the response, that the carrier might provide guidance as to whether or not local law enforcement should be notified, who would then in turn decide whether or not the FBI, or in some cases the Secret Service, need to get involved, the Treasury Department, whether or not systems need to be frozen for forensics. The insurance provider might have their own preferred vendors they work with for forensics work and recovery, and market, communications and consumer protection compliance. So, Andy, if you can talk a little bit about the role of the cyber insurance carrier in the incident response process.
Yeah, and I think Bill, you've particularly laid out, kind of all the pieces, a number of the pieces that are involved here and how complex this can get, right? And so, and yes, almost every carrier has their preferred panel of vendors, right? Who they are pre-approved to do the work and the rates are approved, right? And they are really experts here. Again, like this is not, if you're involved in an incident, this is not like a time to DIY the response here, right? Because you can create a lot more problems for yourself, particularly around the forensics, right? So often what incident responders are doing is looking and seeing what was touched, right? And if you end up, essentially destroying a lot of that evidence and immediately trying to, reboot or, to reset some of those systems, you can destroy that forensics evidence, and suddenly you have to assume that the attacker touched everything. So you took what was a small problem and made it much, much bigger, right? And so
that's a great point, Andy. Yeah, great point.
So, we have a hotline, we have that gets answered by a law firm, and immediately counsel is providing some guidance. Better than 50% of the time that hotline gets called and, the incident is not a big deal, right? But gosh, the ones where it is, so glad that, that they started down the right path, both getting the right counsel on the legal side, getting the right incident responders in place, starting to think about the notification to various regulators and agencies, because there's some pretty hard clocks on doing that, 48 hours, et cetera. And also just getting some people who this is not the first time that they're dealing with this, right? And the emotional, I know it's touchy feely, but for so many of these businesses, like, they're facing what could be a catastrophic business ending type scenario, and having someone who this is their regular Tuesday, right? Like we often talk about a cyber incident like the Super Bowl, but you just don't know when it's going to start, right? do you want, I mean, we're in New England. Who doesn't want Tom Brady there, running his Super Bowl? I'm sorry he moved to Florida. Still, the GOAT, right? You want that level of instant responder. And that's what you get when you start to have some of these folks that do it every day.
Yeah, Andy, to that point, we involve our cyber insurance carrier in our incident response tabletop testing. So, it just makes all the sense in the world to include them, because if they're going to take control and help us respond, we need to be aware of what their processes are and make sure we're in lockstep and our processes don't step on their processes, and we don't do something that will disqualify us from collecting. So I'd encourage everyone to try to get them involved. It's becoming harder to do so, but it is a very good idea, or at the very least, update your incident response procedures to include them, and what the expectation is, and who you call, and what your breach coach name is, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up too on Alan's question regarding law enforcement. I'll just offer a few thoughts on that. So that tends to get very mixed reactions from certain companies. Some want to immediately go to law enforcement. Some are terrified of it. So I just I'll share with kind of how we approach that. So rarely does, some people will call the local police. Sometimes that might be useful, but the local police, in terms of a lost laptop, employee theft, we have had breaches which have actually been prosecuted by the local police as theft, in terms of stealing, especially with respect to internal threats. But most of the time, what we're talking about here in terms of hacks or like ransomware or phishing, that's really outside of their jurisdiction. Many states do have state police cybercrime units, which are focused on these matters, who can be very helpful. So I would keep in mind that. In terms of Andy's point of getting ready, it is, and actually Greg's too, with a tabletop, you don't want to have to start figuring out who to contact the first, if this is your first breach. You want to have your advisors have the relationships already in place, know them on a first name basis, know when to call, when not to call, and know who to call. There was a question about the FBI. We just did a presentation a couple of weeks ago with the sister publication, the Hartford Business Journal. We hosted an event with them and the FBI out of New Haven, and one of the cybercrime office there. And one of the things, I think one of the takeaways is that the FBI is not your help desk, they're not your IT service provider, but in certain times they can be extremely valuable. And particularly when you have a ransomware as a known or common variant, you'd be surprised that you're getting hit by something, and maybe this is actually a recent case we've had, that the FBI out of Tampa actually has an open investigation. And forget about that ransom note or you're worrying about backup. The FBI in Tampa actually has the decryption key, and they'll just send it to you. So don't underestimate how helpful it can be. You can file the IC3 complaints online, but sometimes if you're in a shutdown, it is helpful to have a direct communication with specialized state police. And these don't exist in all states, depending on where your facility is located, if you have a factory in Texas or something. But know those people and know who to contact, because they might, sometimes you'll get lucky. And also is also helpful for them, because if this is a variant of interest, if it's a cyber criminal of interest, what you learn from your breach response can be helpful for the federal government to bring charges against them, to bring some sort of action against them. So it really is a two-way street. You can help them; they can help you.
Yeah, and I don't know. I love your perspective. I mean, I think for some folks in business, the first thing is not to think about calling the government for help, right? And I think but for the most part, I don't think that the law enforcement that is involved here, when they are involved, their first reaction is not to turn around and blame the victim and try and find a way to build a case against you who are the victim of an attack, right? And I think when we see things go particularly badly, it's when organizations have tried to hide or obscure what happened and haven't been forthright. And I think we've seen that. Honestly, we've seen that both with law enforcement, but we've also seen it with the general public as well, right? Like, the idea that you're going to have an incident, particularly of any size, and it's not going to get out is, who are you kidding, right? Like you have probably lots of employees who know about this. Your suppliers are going to know about this. Customers are going to know about this, right? So, right? It's, what do they say? It's the cover up that really gets you in trouble often.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And so we've only got a few minutes left, and just one last comment on law enforcement is it was seen with the Colonial Pipeline hack. The FBI and the Secret Service, so the Treasury Department, were actually pretty successful in recovering a good percentage of funds that had been removed, and so there's assistance there. But also, I have a peer in the industry with out in Minnesota with a client. Their carrier asked them to get the FBI involved, and the FBI involved. Agents involved advised them that the attacker was probably affiliated with a terrorist group, and paying the ransom would violate federal law.
Yep.
And so, so it's never a simple thing. So I guess in summary, we've got a panel of experts here. In summary, trust your experts and leverage your experts, and bring the experts into the planning process. So that you can prevent and prepare, and should something happen, you'll be able to respond. And so I think Chris is going to join us back online as we wrap this up, as we head to the bottom of the hour.
Yeah, and while she does that, I just want to say thank you to all of the panelists. I thought such a fun discussion from so many different angles. Right, thank you for including me.
Well, thank you for being here, all of you. We greatly
Thanks.
appreciate it.
Appreciate
Really
it.
was a fantastic discussion, very informative. Thank you again, Alan, Andy, Greg, and Bill. We really appreciate your participation and the valuable insight that you shared with everyone today. Special thanks again to our sponsor, Middlesex Savings Bank, for their support of this webcast. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll send a link out to the recording as soon as it's up.